So in terms of material we're going to cover, so 10:45 to 11:45, we're going to have presentations on non-technical skills research. So Oliver will talk about non-technical skills in aviation, Ruby will talk about non-technical skills in offshore industry, I'll talk about non-technical skills in farming research. During the presentations, for the purpose of the webinar, what we would like you to do is save all your questions to the end. So we'll basically have presentation, 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 and then we've got 15 minutes for questions at the end. That's just to make sure that for recording purposes, we have a nice, smooth recording of the presentation material. So do just jot down your questions and ask them all at the end. Following discussion and the presentations, we'll then have focus groups where we're really going to be getting your insights into non-technical skills in agriculture, thinking about the factors that might affect these and having a good discussion and getting your insights and perspectives. We'll then have a break for lunch, and then this afternoon, Ruby is once again going to be talking about non-technical skills, this time in terms of non-technical skills training. Then we will have Ian presenting the Health and Safety Executive perspective, and then Alan will present the IOSH perspective. So our speakers, just a reminder, myself, Dr. Ruby Roberts and Oliver, and then we have Ian Silgan and Alan Plum. So before we move on to the full presentations, I just wanted to give a very quick context of non-technical skills, just to kind of put everything that we're talking about in context. So one of the possibly most important things to be aware of is that general research shows that up to 80% of accident causes are linked to human error. Now, this doesn't mean that we're putting the blame on any human worker. It just means that 80% of the causes are related to the human element, so things that people have done or didn't do, mistakes, lapses, and so on. Now, there are a variety of causes that lead to humans making mistakes, and we'll be talking about those in more detail later. But just important to recognize that human error is a major causal factor in incidents and accidents. Now, from a non-technical skills perspective, we're not trying to fully eliminate human error. People are always going to make mistakes, whether they're tired or they're stressed or working long hours or what have you. But what non-technical skills can do is help to reduce the likelihood of an error occurring, and it can help people on the front line catch those errors before they turn into a major issue, accident, or injury. So, overview, non-technical skills are the social and cognitive skills that, in conjunction with technical and procedural knowledge, help workers to be safe in the workplace. Social skills include things like teamwork, leadership, communication, basically all about how we interact with one another, how we can coordinate our efforts, how we can share information. And then we have cognitive skills, things like situation awareness, your mental picture of what's going on around you, your ability to make good and effective decisions, and your ability to manage the tasks. So managing work procedures, making sure everyone adheres to protocol, that you meet deadlines and so on. Now, calling them non-technical skills is possibly a bit of a misnomer in that we've called them that to distinguish them from technical knowledge, but non-technical skills and technical knowledge essentially go hand in hand. So non-technical skills will be used to communicate and share technically relevant information. So for example, if you are going to communicate about a task, it will be your technical knowledge that informs what you will say, but it's your ability to communicate effectively that is your non-technical skill. So the two elements mesh together. Similarly, in terms of decision making, your assessment of a situation will be based on your technical knowledge and competence, but your ability to make a good, effective, and swift decision, that's your non-technical skill. So again, the two are coming together. Equally, and this has been recognized in all high-risk industries, is the knowledge that technical knowledge alone can't fully protect against human error. So if you take this example from the healthcare industry, if you think about a kidney operation to remove an unhealthy kidney, might have proceeded with precise dissection, minimal bleeding, technically perfect, but executed on the wrong side, so it was the healthy kidney rather than the unhealthy kidney that was removed. So technically, procedurally, perfect, but lacking on the non-technical side, so the kidney that was meant to be removed wasn't communicated fully or marked appropriately, a lack of situation awareness in terms of spotting the signs of an unhealthy kidney to identify that was the one that should have been removed. So it's really important to have both technical knowledge and these non-technical skills. Non-technical skills don't exist in a vacuum. We're not saying these are the only things that are important in maintaining safety in an organization. They're one component of a safety management system. If you see the posters that we've put on the tables in front of you, you can see that non-technicals fit with other elements such as safety climate, technical procedures, regulation guidelines, and so forth. But what non-technical skills are is what best practitioners do to maintain and achieve good practice. And it's what the rest of us do on our very best day. So if we can really enhance these skills and make everyone the best practitioner that they can possibly be, then we can work towards mitigating and reducing the likelihood of an error. Reason put together a Swiss cheese model that can help put non-technical skills in context. The idea behind this is that adverse incidents are caused by a combination of active failures and latent conditions. Latent conditions are things like having to work long hours, having a lack of training, having a noisy environment, and what have you. And then active failures are more the human element, so mistakes, errors, lapses. But a human error never exists in isolation. It's never just one person making a mistake that causes the worst case scenario to happen. There will be a variety of factors that will have led up to that point and made the error almost inevitable. But non-technical skills can be the last barrier to an adverse incident occurring and can help, again, preventing that, those issues or problems from turning into a major incident. So, in the context of when we're talking about non-technical skills, we're doing it with the assumption that humans are fallible, and so people are going to make mistakes. What we can't change is the human condition. People are always going to make errors. We're never going to be perfect automatons who will never make a mistake in our lives. But what we can do is change the conditions under which humans work, and non-technical skills is part of that. So non-technical skills can help increase recovery from error. They can help avoid accidents, so they can avoid a small error turning into a major incident. And things that we'll be talking about are things that you will probably all recognize, things such as spotting a trailer load is unbalanced before the driver leaves and preventing that person leaving until the load has been sorted out. Checking that grain bin is empty before you put the grain into the bin. Telling someone to watch out for low bridge is sharing your information about the environment. Planning ahead to ensure that moving cattle goes smoothly. So these are all things that farmers are perfectly able to do. It's really just a question of enhancing these skills so we can make everyone the best practitioner that they can be. And so the aim of today is really that we want to discuss the non-technical skills research with you. We want you to consider how important and relevant you think non-technical skills are to farming. We want you guys to think about which of these skills that we talk about do you think are going to be most important or most relevant for safety on the farm specifically. What kind of factors do you think might influence these non-technical skills? So if you're tired, are you going to be less able to pay attention to what's going on around you, for example? And then we want to discuss with you what the next steps for non-technical skills in agriculture might be. So we're really looking for ideas and discussion with you guys. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we'll run through the next 3 presentations. Please note down your questions and save them for the end. There'll be 15 minutes of question time after the final presentation, which will be me again. So pass over to Ruby.
Aloha. I just want to check my microphone works there. It's a pleasure to be here. Am I in the right location?
Yeah, just give me 2 seconds to get the files up.
Okie dokie. All right. So while we're waiting for the files, it's very satisfying to be here because I actually graduated my PhD, and this is the last time I was in this building, was to get my hat and cap and gown and do the full shebang. So it's actually quite nice to be here again. Okay, now we're ready to go. So I'm Dr. Ruby Roberts. I'm an organizational psychologist. As I said, I have a background in psychology. I've done my PhD here, and I now work for a consultancy firm in Aberdeen looking at non-technical skills and human factors and coming up with more practical solutions on how to cope with these various problems. So what we're going to do, can I go up? Can I go down? Down? Hey, wonderful. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover what non-technical skills are, because I appreciate this is the beginning of the presentation, it's the beginning of the day, there's no point in us spending 6 hours in talking about non-technical skills if we don't know what they are. Why are they important for safety? And how are they applied in other industries? So what can we learn from other industries? And I'm going to particularly talk about my insight from oil and gas. And then I know again it'll be very early in the day, I just wanted to give us some things to think about at the very end. So, I don't know if anybody else is a fan of NASA. Any NASA fans in the room? Is it just me? No NASA fans? Thank you very much. Thank you. Way. Okay. So the reason I bring this up is because non-technical skills originated in NASA. But one of those, if anybody else a lover of Apollo 13, it's one of my favorite films. Thank you very much. So back in the 60s and 70s, they were experiencing some really high-profile incidents. Apollo 13 made a great film, but this is really where it starts to come out. And they were really starting to struggle to try and work out what it was that was leading to these really high-profile disasters. And not only was this really bad in terms of loss of life, it was terrible for their reputation. And reputation, as we all know, means money. So what they started to do is have a look at these incidents to try and figure out what it was that was going wrong. And this is where they came up with the idea of non-technical skills. And really, it wasn't a complex thing, it wasn't a big deal back then. It was really just a way to improve their flight crew's teamwork, their leadership, the decisions they were making, and their situation awareness. So aviation is now seen as what? The world leader, or gold standard in terms of non-technical skills. But they didn't pick this up until sort of the mid-70s, late 70s. And again, this was really because they were starting to experience really high-profile incidents. An example of that was the Tenerife crash in 1977. So we can see, it's just a little picture, but we can see two Boeing 747s crashing into each other. Like this, really it's as simple as that. And what happened was, one plane was taxiing to take off, as we have done many a time in our own travels, and another decided that no, it couldn't wait, it was no longer going to wait, and so it taxied right into the side of it. Now, over 500 people died. And we all look horrified, right? That's a horrific thing to happen. But it's much more complicated kind of thing than it might sound at first. There were a lot of influencing factors. So people were tired, there were poor communication. For a start, they couldn't see each other because there was fog. And when they started doing investigations into why had this happened, what had gone wrong, it was these non-technical skills that were starting to come up. And this is where aviation started to really get interested in it. So aviation starts to get interested in non-technical skills, and they refer to it as cruise resource management. And this is just a form of training, and I will talk about this afternoon. But for the sake of clarity, when I talk about cruise resource management, I also mean non-technical skills. It's the same set of skills. Non-technical skills is just the term that European aviation use. I don't know what it is about across the pond, they just have different phrases. So that's where it came from. So what are non-technical skills? As Amy said a couple of minutes ago, they're cognitive, social, and personal resource skills. They complement technical ability, and they contribute to safe and effective performance. Now that's a really wordy way of putting it. You know, that's my academic desire to come out and put boxes up. But in my experience working in oil and gas and working out in medicine, people don't buy into that very quickly. So sometimes what you need is you need to have a conversation. You need to ask them how it is that they do their job. What is it that they do? And after about 10, 15 minutes of conversation, you'll find that it's these skills that make someone particularly good at their job. So it's not just being technically competent, it's about having this and being able to integrate that into their daily working lives. So a couple of things that I have to mention about non-technical skills, because I think they're important to keep in mind. So these are widely now recognized as important for safe and effective performance, excuse me, and that's in a range of domains. The purpose of non-technical skills is to train individuals to cope with not just your routine, your daily life, or your daily working life, but also emergency crisis situations. You train them to be able to cope with that. Non-technical skills, okay, we know that they come from aviation, but it's not sufficient just to copy and paste. If you want to do work in non-technical skills, they need to be based on empirical, domain-specific research. They can then, of course, be used to develop specific training. You can do measurement aspects, and there's a whole wealth of different types of solutions that you can come up with once you put that time and effort in. They are based on behaviors, okay? And I say this because I don't know about you guys, but I've had many a conversation where it's like, well, you know, this guy did this, but it's just how he is. Personality is not an excuse. You can behave and however you want outside the workplace. But what non-technical skills are going for are these are the set of behaviors I want to see you to do in the workplace. So if somebody tells me, and I will let you in a secret, somebody actually told me this, they said, I'm sorry if my emails are a bit off. This is just the way I communicate. I'm not angry with you, it's just the way I send emails. And I went, I'm sorry. We're talking about non-technical skills. This is not appropriate. So the last final point is that they're based on the individual worker. This comes from aviation, where pilots and crews, they will rotate around frequently. So you're not thinking specifically around the team, you're thinking about that individual. So we have our cognitive skills. So these are situation awareness and decision making. Situation awareness, as Amy said, is essentially knowing what's going on around you. So as I stand here, I'm aware of all of you sitting at tables, I'm aware of my location in terms of the University of Aberdeen, etc. Then you can use this understanding of what's going on, and then you can anticipate what might happen next. So a small example might be that I anticipate who is now going to speak after me, my plan for the day, etc. And then you can use that awareness as a foundation for the decisions that you make. So if you have a poor situation awareness, it's very unlikely, or it's going to be a lot trickier to make an effective decision. So our social skills, okay, we've got a lot to do with teamwork. And it's really just a showing that you get the job done. But getting the job done is a lot harder than it sounds when you try and do that in practice, particularly if you have a set of individuals who have their own opinions on how to do something best, and well, I'm an expert at this and this is how I'm going to do it, etc. So it often requires a high level of coordination, the ability to cooperate, and a big one is how to cope with conflict. We also have a bit on leadership. So how is it that you can support that team best to get those tasks done? Oh, I think somebody's playing the flute upstairs. Nobody else seeing that? Lovely. So we'll finally also have communication. And communication is a real fundamental one, because without effective communication, it's very difficult to have leadership, teamwork, decision-making, and situation awareness. It's something that really glues them all together. And then finally, we have personal resource skills. You can call it what you like, but really what we're talking about is stress and fatigue. We all suffer from stress and fatigue at some point. I don't care how many oil guys tell me that they do not, they do. And so what you need to have is a set of skills where you can cope with that, because you will go through periods of stressfulness or fatigue depending on how much you need to get done. And so it's being able to have these skills to cope with them. So, originated in aviation, what does everybody else do? Well, non-technical skills have been recognized as important in healthcare and a range of industries. So we've got right up from surgeons, like the little photo we have there, right down to scrub nurses. We have them for paramedics, we have them for emergency response teams, medivacs that come in off the choppers. If you see them coming in into Aberdeen, they all have non-technical skills training. It's also very prevalent in nuclear power. Nuclear power was a real proponent of non-technical skills and started to introduce it very early on as the late 80s, early 90s. People like firefighters and even Maersk shipping. Maersk shipping is a great one. So they often experience the same situation, the same pattern comes out, that they have a problem, and it's often in terms of safety and performance, and that normally costs them something. So as a little example, in medicine, it's estimated that around 10% of adverse events are caused by poor non-technical skills. That's quite a lot, and it costs the US health system about $27 billion a year, not in total, but a year. So with non-technical skills for surgeons, which I would just like to make a little pointer, actually originated from the University of Aberdeen, that was introduced in the US, a relatively small cohort, about 74 hospitals. And they saw a whopping reduction of 18% mortality. I mean, that's crazy, that's a huge amount. And that was in the first year. So you can imagine the kind of impact that they could have over a series of years. There are methods of doing this. There are methods of developing tailored non-technical skills. So please don't get it in your heads that I'm saying that this is some huge, giant, unbearably huge task to do. There are methods for doing this. And really the whole point is for the positive outcome, right? So we can have basic things where it just improved knowledge of non-technical skills. Okay, that's quite useful, but it's not that important if you have to take it to a board meeting, right? We can also see improvement on safety attitudes, but then we're starting to look at things like change behaviors and changes in safety outcomes. So the reason that I have the little shipping container boat up there is because Maersk Drilling and Maersk Shipping recognized the importance of non-technical skills very early on. They saw that about 80% is pretty high, of all of their incidents on the large shipping containers were related to human error. And they found this out about 1992, so very early on. And they introduced a form of crew resource management called bridge resource management. It's used in the Navy, it's used in any kind of form of naval work. And they saw a huge reduction in their incidents, and it cost them something like 30 billion in lost time. And that was, I think the paper was something like from the 1997. So I can't even imagine how much it saved them now in 2018. So, oil and gas, this is my love. And you want to talk to me about drilling later on, come on board. So, 2011, there was Deepwater Horizon. It was huge. It was a high-profile incident. Essentially, this is Deepwater Horizon. Underneath all those flames was a rig, once upon a time. The drill crew misunderstood the situation. They took the wrong action, i.e. they took no action, and this resulted in a blowout. The rig essentially exploded. And it was 14 were dead. BP alone, I think the most recent estimate is 43 billion that it's cost, just BP, not the other companies that were involved. And it's a huge environmental disaster. Now, when they looked at investigation reports, they found that there were really poor non-technical skills in relation to the drill crew. So the 6 or 7 guys that are responsible for drilling wells, essentially. I thought, awesome. This is where my PhD comes in. I see a gap. I'm going to go for it. But what I was horrified to find was very little research. So what do? You know, the industry had made a kind of tentative response, mostly because it was on TV all the time, but very little. So what we wanted to do was understand a specific non-technical skill. And we were looking at this specific non-technical skill because it had been identified as particularly important for their role. So how do we do this? Well, firstly, we have to understand the role and the task. We can't develop non-technical skills, markers, or training unless we understand what they do. So we did that through a set of methods, so data collection methods, things like interviews, focus groups, observations, cognitive task analysis, with the essential purpose of trying to understand what these specific non-technical skills were. So how were they developing a mental model of what was going on in the well, etc. And that's awesome from an academic point of view. You can do lots of papers on it. But if you have a funder and you have an applied PhD, they want something at the end, yeah, because you've just spent a lot of money on them. So what we did is we developed interventions. So just essentially methods to support the driller. How can we best do this? And we came up with a set of different methods. One was the incident analysis, so having a look at their well control incidents to try and pick out what these non-technical skills were and what was going wrong and how could they try and circumvent that. Behavioral marker tool, I will talk about this afternoon. A behavioral marker tool is essentially a way of assessing non-technical skills, and then we did some simulated training. So I appreciate that was a bit of a whirlwind, and we're only at the very beginning of our day session. But just a couple of things to think about. Please don't wait for a disaster to happen. The general pattern in other industries is they wait for a giant, huge profile, very costly incident to come up. There is a wealth of industry, research and statistics and data that support that agriculture could really do with looking at this, much of which comes from AE. Recognize the commonalities. I mean, in terms of aviation, nuclear power, surgeons, etc. Even in drilling, there are lots of examples where they share commonalities. Things like working very long shifts. Often I'll go to work in the morning and I'll see the tractor in the field, and I'll come home and I'll see the tractor in the field. I'll take the dog out and I'll see the tractor in the field. And I wonder when they go to bed, you know? And it's doing often quite monotonous work, but it's really intense work. You've got lots of, in the more complex pieces of equipment, you've got a lot of readouts, there's a lot to look at. And it's really dangerous pieces of equipment, you know? This isn't, you know, some small little thing that we're doing. These are big pieces of equipment. And then we have the added kind of complexity, which is lone working. You're working perhaps in a remote area by yourself, and you might not see anybody for a good couple of hours. You might not see anybody all day. What's that going to do? How is that going to play in with those non-technical skills? Please don't be disheartened. There is a method for doing this. And that method can then be used to support other safety interventions. So it's not just like throwing a huge pile of cash into, again, you get one thing. You can throw a whole pile of cash and you can get a lot of different things depending on what you want. So I'm going to hand over to Oliver. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you found it interesting.
That's all. Okay, good to go. Great. Okay, so my name is Oliver Hamlet, and I am about 3/4 of the way through my first year of my PhD, and I'm studying human factors, specifically non-technical skills within aviation. So really what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 15 minutes is the background to that research and what we're doing currently at this phase. Okay, so I recognize Ruby's covered a lot of this, but just to kind of go over it again, the reason why we're looking at non-technical skills in aviation is because the topic really originated from the domain. So non-technical skills is an outgrowth of crew resource management training. So there are similar skills that they're looking at. And some CRM trainers will actually call them CRM skills, others will call them non-technical skills. But really, this kind of research has come about over the last 4 decades or so. So previous research shows us that 70 to 80% of aviation accidents occur due to or else implicate human error. So what I mean by that, for example, an accident in 1972 in Florida, a plane was coming in and the crew became so distracted by a faulty warning light on the control panel that they didn't realize the plane had descended so much that it crashed into a hill. Tenerife, which I'll talk about slightly more in a second, and Kegworth's another example, a plane coming into land and they misidentify which engine's on fire. They put fuel into the engine that's on fire and they turn off the correctly working engine, which makes the disaster worse and they crash. So that's what I mean by implicating human error. So there was a technical fault there, but if the human operator made it worse by incorrectly acting afterwards. So just briefly to go over this, Ruby did talk about this. So Tenerife, essentially what happened, there was a bomb threat nearby, all local air traffic is grounded at Tenerife, there's heavy fog, and the KLM flight was instructed to go down the runway, turn around and come back. And a Pan Am flight was told to follow it, turn off onto the taxiway about halfway down the runway to make room for the KLM flight to go down. The issue here is that both aircraft were fully reliant on air traffic control to tell them what was going on in their surroundings because they couldn't see. Once turned around, the KLM flight, assuming it had authorization to go, accelerated down the runway before the Pan Am flight had turned off. So essentially, that's what happened. And it is the worst aviation disaster on record. So 583 people died. The reason why Tenerife is such an interesting example for researchers who look at non-technical skills is because there's such apparent lapses in these skills. So for example, situation awareness, the KLM flight was unaware of the Pan Am flight that was still taxiing down the runway. Decision making, the KLM flight captain made the decision to take off without proper clearance, all while not being able to see the full length of the runway. Leadership, the KLM captain was actually advised by the co-pilot to gain clearance and communication and teamwork. So while the co-pilot was trying to get that clearance, he advised ATC, we are at takeoff. So ATC and Pan Am heard we are at takeoff and interpreted that as we're in position, we're ready to go, not we are actually going. So as Amy demonstrated with the Swiss cheese model, you know, there's several lapses that can lead to a really catastrophic disaster. So just to kind of give a timeline of where we're at now. So 1977 is when Tenerife happened. NASA met, had a conference, brought together aviation psychologists and human factors experts. And a lot of the operators that went along to that conference left committed to developing CRM training within the industry. And that CRM kind of evolved over the next several years. So the first generation was called cockpit resource management and was really focused around the commander and the co-pilot. And then over the next 10, 15 years, that expanded with the advent of having simulator training coming in within the early 90s that allowed operators to train non-technical skills in a high-risk environment, but not in a real environment. Come 1996 is when NTSAg started, which was a really big effort to bring together these taxonomies of pilot skills, bring them together, interview pilots, and to create categories of skills that pilots use, and to produce a behavioral marker system to assess these skills. From there, non-technical skills taxonomy sort of spread into other domains of high risks. They went into healthcare using a similar sort of method, and there was really an expansion of non-technical skills research from 2003, which goes into oil and gas, it goes into nuclear industry, and currently into agriculture. So that's how we got to where we are now. So to talk about what I'm doing specifically, I'm looking at the non-technical skills of helicopter pilots and comparing helicopter pilot groups. So my supervisor is Dr. Amy Irwin, and my secondary supervisor is Professor Rona Flynn, who actually was part of the NTSAg team. So when we write about and justify why we're studying helicopter pilot skills, we're often asked the question, if there's already a taxonomy in place for fixed-wing pilots, why would you create another one for rotorcraft pilots? And really the key answer to that question is that helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft have fundamentally different roles and different capabilities. So in an airplane, you're going to be moving from A to B, pretty much straightforward. Whereas in a helicopter, you have the ability to stop. You can hover, you can rotate, you can go up and down. And along with those capabilities, you have different, so you need less ground infrastructure. For example, a helicopter really needs just a flat surface to land on. A plane will need a runway. So obviously, based on those parameters, you're going to get different roles for those vehicles. They have different accident rates. So in 2015, for example, for 100,000 hours of flight, the accident rate for commercial fixed-wing airlines was 0.32. For rotorcraft, that was 2.79. So that means it's an 8.7 times higher likelihood of an accident in a rotorcraft than there is in a fixed-wing aircraft. So like I said, non-technical skills taxonomies have spread to other domains of high risk, but there's not a consistent rotorcraft taxonomy in place, such as NTSAg for fixed-wing pilots. So we're looking at helicopter pilot skills, but we're also looking at different groups of helicopter pilots. So within helicopter operation, you get different crew sizes, different mission types, you've got different pressures upon the pilots. So offshore transport, for example, is a two-crew operation. You've got planned back and forth to rigs, platforms, and there's a lot of similarities there to commercial fixed-wing aviation. So you've got point A, point B, and you go there back and forth. And a lot of the pilots that we've spoken to say, we're just bus drivers. We just go that, and it's the same every day. So it's very routine-based. Then you've got a different operation, such as search and rescue, which can have 4 to 6 members in the UK. You've got 4, so you've got the commander, the co-pilot, the winch operator, and the winchman paramedic. In Canada, you've got 2 paramedics, and in some papers I've read, in Scandinavia, you can actually get 3 paramedics on board. So it's really dependent on the size of the aircraft, but there's more crew, which means obviously the non-technical skills are going to vary based on that. So if you've got more eyes looking at the aircraft, you're going to get different levels of situation awareness, for example. It's more unplanned. They provide rescue and medical assistance. There's a lot more similarities to emergency services there than you would see as opposed to commercial fixed-wing aviation. So research has suggested that based just upon having these different aircraft with different capabilities, you would see different skills coming out or different applications of these skills. So it's important to say at this point as well that CRM is mandated. So training within aviation is mandated by EASA, which is the European Aviation Safety Agency. And they have a document called the Acceptable Means of Compliance, which is a set of guidelines that operators have to put into place to maintain a valid license. It's a huge document, and it relates to pretty much everything, but there's 2 parts of it that really relate to CRM, which is the part organization requirements for air operations, which is the stuff that the operator has to put into place. They have to provide CRM training. And then you've got the part flight crew licensing, which is essentially what the pilot has to do to maintain his valid license. So they have to train every 2 years, they have to train if they're going on to a new aircraft type, and they have to train if they're going from a single pilot aircraft to a multi-pilot aircraft. So there are regulations in place that say pilots have to go through these hoops. What's interesting about that is that EASA specifically recommends NOTEX or other acceptable methods, but they name NOTEX in their document as an acceptable method of non-technical skills assessment. And that's interesting because NOTEX is based upon fixed-wing commercial aviation. So there are differences, as we've just talked about, between fixed-wing commercial aviation and an operation like search and rescue. But search and rescue pilots will still be assessed by a similar non-technical skills behavioral marker system. So the first study we did, and that video should play in a second, but it might not, we looked at the Air Accident Investigation Branch's database for recent human error-related accidents. We interviewed offshore transport and search and rescue pilots. We thematically coded all the data from those interviews, so we had about 200,000 words based on those interviews, and we went through it and we basically said, what are they talking about, what themes are coming up, and what are the differences between the two groups. We did a task analysis, so there we go. So this is us flying with search and rescue. We did a task analysis, so we mapped out when those skills came into play at various stages of flight. Was task management different in the preliminary stages of flight to post-flight, for example? And this is kind of what we came up with. So not going to talk long about this, just to touch on it. We found differences in pretty much every skill. So teamwork, for example, was more to do with training for search and rescue. They trained as part of a team unit, whereas training for search and rescue, training for offshore transport was more leadership based. So you had one senior pilot training a junior pilot. Situation awareness contains similar elements. They were perceiving things, they were comprehending them, and they were looking to the future. But situation awareness was centered around different things. We also said that planning was a part of situation awareness for search and rescue pilots because often they didn't have the information in the hangar, they were gathering it en route. Whereas we said planning was more task management based for offshore transport pilots, so they were doing their planning while they were in the hangar. Communication was relatively similar. They used similar methods of communication. Search and rescue pilots were more non-verbally based, so they were giving hand signals to winch wing going down. But the content varied, and the same with decision making. It was kind of centered around different things, so different risk thresholds, different go, no-go decisions. But the main finding that I really want to talk about was that we have included a category of cognitive readiness for the search and rescue pilots. So the idea to when we were going through the data, we found a lot of quotes to do with sort of reaction to unforeseen circumstances, problem solving on the job, and flexibility included in the search and rescue data that wasn't there in the offshore transport data, not to the same degree anyway. So we included cognitive readiness. So this is a skill that's commonly detailed within military surgical and rescue environments. It originates from the military. So I think it was called military cognitive readiness originally. And so we made it up of 3 elements based on that literature: preparedness, flexibility, and problem solving. And just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff that we got from that, so here's an example. It's just making sure everyone is fit to fly and briefed on all the possible things, because we don't really know what we're going to do at any stage. So it's quotes like that that led us to creating that category. So the guy's saying that everyone has to be prepared and ready to react. Quite often the weather isn't quite as advertised, then you'll be planning and changing your plan en route. So that's like an adaptability sort of thing. So going into the second study, which we're currently doing right now, we wanted to, based upon the findings, and particularly that cognitive readiness category and including that within our results, we wanted to kind of look at 3 things going into the second stage of the study. We wanted to explore the factors that influence non-technical skills. So we know what the non-technical skills are, what makes the pilot have a good day in terms of situation awareness, or a bad day. We wanted to see which non-technical skills were perceived as most important by the pilots. And we wanted to further validate the categories that we identified. So we have got our categories of what we believe the skills are that the pilots use. We want to see if the pilots agree with that. And we also want to change it into their terminology, so take it away from our kind of psychological write-up and have it in a way that a pilot will read it and say, yes, that makes sense to me. So currently, we're doing focus groups. So we've got 8 focus groups per pilot role. So we've got 8 offshore transport ones and 8 search and rescue ones. And that's going to be from multiple operators. So we've just finished speaking to one operator. We're just going to move to another one and speak some more. Each pilot group contained about 2 pilots. We had 2 focus groups with 3. Ideally, we wanted more, but it's very hard to balance pilot timetables. So the reason for the focus group format is just to get them to speak to each other. So we did interviews last year, and now if they speak to each other, we can kind of uncover more themes based upon them bouncing ideas off each other. They lasted an hour. Same as last year, we recorded them and we transcribed them, and we automatically code them again. So we take the data, we look through it, and we kind of figure out the recurring themes about what they're talking about. So here's some quotes. And this is from the first part. So this is us looking at the factors that influence non-technical skills. So one pilot said, if you're coming in tired, your situation awareness will be a bit ropey. You probably won't make the best decisions because of that. So they have mentioned tiredness, and we have, based upon data that's come up reoccurring in several different interviews, we're saying that is fatigue. They're talking about survival suits and life jackets and how that's a distraction, personal stresses, and unexpected changes. So talking about how if unexpected things come up, it can be quite hard to adapt sometimes. And the sum of that, and this is just based on the offshore transport pilots right now, we came up with these factors and these subcategories. So we said comfort, and we split that into aircraft type and ergonomics, so that whether the cockpit of the aircraft is comfortable, whether your life jacket is comfortable. We put in a category for external distractions, so vibration, noise, weather outside, these things can distract you. Fatigue, we split fatigue into being fatigued, because they often talked about when you're fatigued without knowing it, but also the effects of recognizing when you're fatigued and how that impacts your non-technical skills. We stuck in a category for personal influences. They talked about illness, they talked about whether you're hungry, and they talked about whether you're just in a bad mood that day. Crew interaction, so often they talked about trying to maintain a flat cockpit gradient. And what that means is that if you have an overbearing commander or a co-pilot that's not speaking up, that would be a steep cockpit gradient. So they wanted to maintain, a flat cockpit gradient. Different personality traits, so sometimes you just don't gel with the person you're in the cockpit with. Conflict, so maybe you've had an argument with your co-pilot, and maybe they're just in a bad mood that day. Stress we split into internal and external, so internal to do with the job, redundancies or things like that. External, maybe you've had an argument back home and you're bringing that stress with you onto the job. And then the final category we came up with was workload. So they talked about having too high workload, whether jobs were too routine, whether there were too many immediate jobs going on at once, task saturation, whether there's your co-pilot speaking to you, alarms are going off, the weather outside is shaking the aircraft, so too many immediate things and unexpected changes. And where we're at now is we have just started this thematic coding process with the search and rescue interviews, and we've looked at the order in which they've placed the skills. So we've seen that communication is rated consistently as the highest skill for offshore transport pilots. So every single offshore transport group has said communication is the most important skill, and every single one said leadership is the least important skill. That's interesting to us. We don't know if that's a factor of the way they've been trained in CRM, so that's why we're taking it to other operators who don't train the same way to see if maybe they feel the same way, or maybe they've just been taught that. And search and rescue, good news for us, they have taken to the cognitive readiness concept very well. In 4 of 5 of the focus groups have done so far, they've rated it within the top 3 skills. Most of them rated number 1. Only one focus group has rated it last, and they changed their mind halfway through the focus group and wanted to rate it first after they read the definition of it. So that's where we're at. And for future directions, we are now going to look at the rear crew. We're going to speak to them, see how their input changes the decision making within the aircraft with the situation awareness. Yeah, and so that's where we're at. So if you've got any questions, then we've got time afterwards, and I'm happy to speak about it. And that's my email address if anyone comes up with a question afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, the last presentation, we're going circling back around to farming. So hopefully you'll start to recognise the context in which we're now talking about non-technical skills. So non-technical skills is something in agriculture that I became interested in about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I had looked at non-technical skills in healthcare and non-technical skills in aviation. And then about 3.5, 4 years ago, a level 4 thesis student came to me who came from a farming background and said, well, what about farmers? So I thought, well, what about farmers? And that started this whole research journey about looking at non-technical skills in agriculture. So I'm just going to try and take you through that journey relatively quickly, just in terms of why I think non-technical skills are potentially important for farming. Some of the studies that we've done thus far, examining what kind of non-technical skills might be relevant, what might predict those non-technical skills, and I also want to talk a little bit about a study where I've taken one particular non-technical skill, this is risk perception and management as related to decision making, and looked at that specifically in relation to tractor-based scenarios. So after my level 4 thesis student came to me and said, what about farmers? I started looking into what the accident rates were, what the fatalities are, etc. Somewhat horrified to discover that fatality rates are very high. 170,000 fatalities worldwide on an annual level, so that's 170,000 fatalities roughly every year. Within the UK, we had 27 fatalities recorded and reported by the NTSAg, and that's a relatively static fatality rate over the past 5 to 10 years. So every year, roughly 25 to 30 fatalities within the UK and Ireland. And this puts agriculture at the top of the leaderboard that you really want to be at the bottom of, because that has a higher fatality rate than any other equivalent high-risk sector, including construction. Now, construction used to top the leaderboard, agriculture has now sadly overtaken them. And of course, these fatalities don't tell the full story. These are the worst case scenarios, but there's also an extremely high injury rate, so 13,000 non-fatal injuries also recorded by the Health and Safety Executive. And since we'll be dealing with a relatively low reporting rate, farmers aren't going to tell us every time they have a near miss or something almost happens, or they have a minor injury that perhaps doesn't require hospitalization. We're not getting the full story about what's really going on purely by looking at these fatality and injury rates. So why is farming associated with such a high fatality rate? Well, farmers have to deal with a range of hazards pretty much day in, day out. I'll be preaching to the choir here, you'll all know this. So we've got things like working from height, having to go up and fix a barn roof, for example, operating a range of heavy machinery, tractors, combine harvesters, and so on. Working with livestock, cattle generally thought to be one of the most dangerous, but there are risks in terms of working with sheep and pigs and whatever as well. Also, as Ruby briefly mentioned, we're talking long hours, and these are tasks that have to be done. So farmers deal with a unique set of pressures whereby there are certain tasks that can't be delayed. You can't really convince a sheep to not lamb at 2 in the morning. They're going to lamb when they're going to lamb. Equally, you need to get a harvest in when the weather's right. So there are certain tasks that have to be done within a certain time frame, and farmers don't have a lot of leeway in terms of delaying tasks or handing these tasks over to someone else. Because that's the other thing about farmers, is that quite a high proportion of them are working on their own. So they don't have anyone that they can hand these tasks off to. But obviously, we're all here because we want to reduce accidents and injuries in agriculture. And this is where I think non-technical skills can come in and hopefully help. And our approach to this, which began about 4 years ago, was the realization there's a complete lack of research looking at non-technical skills in agriculture. So we thought that we would start looking into this. One of the first steps that you do when you start looking at a particular industrial area is you start looking at the accidents, reading about what happened and thinking, do these accidents give indications of some kind of non-technical skills failures? So are non-technical skills going to be relevant? Are failures related to some of the accidents that are happening? Pretty much across the board, when you look at accidents, there are a range of factors that are involved, but lapses of non-technical skills are in there as well. So I just took out some sort of excerpts. Again, some of these will probably resonate with you. Issues such as a farmer who's aware of a hazard but doesn't alert anyone else to the hazard. So you've got a case where you've got one farmer who knows that hazard. For example, overhead power lines are present in a field, doesn't tell anyone else about them. So we've got issues with communication, with shared situation awareness, one person knowing the risk, other people not knowing the risk. You've got assumptions, so people tend to think, oh, people will just, they'll know how to do the job. I don't need to tell them. I don't need to necessarily keep an eye on them. Things to do with teamwork and leadership. We've got cases where supervisors are advising trainees to perhaps engage in risky behaviours. In one particular case that I found, the risk assessment indicated they shouldn't use a ladder. Supervisor felt under time pressure, recommended the trainee use the ladder in any case, led to an accident. So we've got issues there with task management, leadership, decision making. In the final issue, now you all know, I don't need to tell you anything about the dangers of PTO shafts, so we shouldn't stand on them. In this case, farmer stood in the PTO shaft. It wasn't because he thought that seems like a good idea. It was more that he was so focused on the task, and we call this cognitive tunneling, so focused on what he needed to do, which was reaching a particular part of machinery in order to fix it so he could carry on with the job, that he stopped recognizing really what else was going on around him. So before he knew it, he was so focused on reaching this piece of machinery, before he knew it, he found he was looking down and he was stood on the PTO shaft. Unfortunately, the shield was cracked, and at that point, clothing became caught. It wasn't a fatality, but obviously that was a dangerous behaviour to engage in. But we're not saying that people are necessarily intentionally engaging in those behaviours. Sometimes if you're so focused on something else, you miss other things that are going on around you. So we wanted to investigate what are going to be the most relevant non-technical skills in farming. So similar to all of the other fields, we started with interviews. So we wanted to interview the people who are on the ground. These are the experts in farming, so we interviewed farmers from the UK and Ireland. Based this on a critical incident technique, basically we got farmers to tell us about accidents and incidents and near misses that they'd had, and then we looked within those incident descriptions to see if we could identify both lapses and examples of good practice in terms of non-technical skills in teams and when working alone. And for farmers, obviously, that's really important because they do work alone a lot. So these are the non-technical skills we found for teams, and we'll be talking about these in detail in the discussion group, so I won't go into too much detail now, but essentially the 5 skills that we found: situation awareness, decision-making, leadership, teamwork, task management. So we're talking in terms of situation awareness, we're talking about being aware of what's going on around you, understanding what issues or hazards or elements in the environment mean, and using that information to predict what might go wrong or what the outcome of a particular behaviour might be. So the example there is the chains weren't on, this was talking about a load on a trailer. The chains weren't on right, I was able to spot that. And this particular farmer then put it right before an incident actually occurred. You've got things such as managing risk. Farmers tend to be quite wary about handling bulls. This particular farmer, every time he went in a field with a particular bull, he'd go in a tractor rather than going in on foot or going in with his dogs. Leadership, really important. One of the skills that we found was keeping an eye on other staff. Quite a few accidents, and this relates not only to other workers, but also we're talking about children and family members who are also on the farm. It's really keeping an eye on other people, knowing where they are, what they're doing, checking on them, making sure nothing's gone wrong in the interim. And this can help mitigate some of the issues in terms of lone working, and also hopefully keep some of your other family members and children and so on out of danger as well. Got people working together, coordinating, and in terms of task management, one of the big things that was identified was really preparing. So thinking ahead, planning a task in advance, putting in aspects and elements that would reduce the risk. In this case, they were moving cattle, and they made sure they put in quick escape routes so that they could jump out of the way if anything went wrong, the cattle started to stampede or what have you. In terms of failures, we're talking about things like lack of awareness when moving a tractor. So in this case, the farmer in question wasn't aware that there were other people in the yard where he was manoeuvring the tractor, almost ran someone over. Didn't run them over, thankfully, but it was a near-run thing. We've got perception issues linked to rushing. One particular farmer reported that he was rushing to get out of his tractor, so he'd hardly stopped the tractor. When he jumped out, jumped straight into a pothole, broke his ankle. And again, this is a case of rushing so much, thinking about something else, not noticing what's going on around you. Leadership, a lot of the issues that happened to workers happened out of sight. So where there wasn't supervision and support of staff, where people were operating alone, no one was checking on them, that's when more serious problems tended to develop. Teamwork, lack of communication. If you don't know what everyone else is doing, where they are, what have you, that can lead to issues. And task management, basically taking shortcuts, not adhering to protocol, not adhering to regulations, or failing to prepare for a task. We also asked them about working on their own. Now, it was interesting, their perspective on the risks of working alone. seemed to be a fairly even split in terms of there were farmers who identified that working alone was risky, no one around to help you if you get into trouble, and so they would delay tasks that they felt were particularly risky until they could have help, or they'd call in temporary workers or what have you. Other farmers were very much of the mind that yes, it is risky, no one around to help me if I get into trouble, however, I'm the only one here who can do this job, so I've got to do it. No one else can take over from me, and if necessary, I'm going to take risks to do that task because I've got to get it done. And this again speaks to the pressures that farmers are dealing with in terms of feeling the pressure to produce what is essentially a product for market that makes them financially viable. And in terms of the lone farmer non-technical skills, we identified a subset of the team skills. We're talking situation awareness, decision-making, task management. Following that, we were interested in thinking about, so what might be individual traits or characteristics or attitudes or aspects that might predict attitudes towards non-technical skills. So what might be the barriers to non-technical skills? What might be the aspects that might heighten the usage or a positive attitude towards non-technical skills? This is an online survey with 170 UK and Irish farmers. We looked at a variety of variables, but the ones that I want to talk about here are stress level. You'll know from recent safety campaigns, stress is a very real issue in farmers. We wanted to look at whether there was an association between stress and non-technical skills. We also wanted to look at safety motivation and safety climate. Essentially, how motivated are farmers to engage in safety behaviours? How likely are they to use safety equipment, for example? And safety climate is the extent to which safety is prioritised on the farm over and above productivity. So the results indicated that there was a relationship between stress and the non-technical skills of leadership and task management. Now, correlation doesn't necessarily give you causation. Any psychologist in the room will have a wry smile at that. But essentially, the indication is that high levels of stress led to a more linked to a more negative attitude towards leadership and task management. Now, we can't say that stress caused this negative attitude. Equally, there could be issues with leadership and task management. So, for example, if the leader of your team, you don't feel they're doing a good job, or you don't feel a task being managed appropriately, that's putting a lot of pressure on you, you can feel overwhelmed, that might lead to stress. Equally, if you're feeling very stressed, you might look to your leader for support. You might want a more structured approach to task management. If you don't feel you're getting it, you might then have a more negative attitude towards those skills. There's also a strong link between safety motivation, safety climate, and non-technical skills. Safety motivation predicted attitudes towards situation awareness and decision making. Basically, the more motivated you were to engage in safety behaviours, the more of a positive attitude you had towards the importance of situation awareness and decision making. Equally, in terms of safety climate, the more important you felt safety was on the farm, the more important you felt leadership and teamwork were as non-technical skills. So the final study I want to briefly go over is our most recent study that just got published this year, and this was where we looked specifically at one non-technical skill, the non-technical skill of decision making, and one element of that, which is risk perception and risk management. Now, this is an experimental vignette study, which basically means that we generated a set of scenarios, each one of which encompassed a risk that was related to tractor use. And we asked 148 UK and Irish farmers to read through each scenario, make a judgment as to whether they would proceed with the task given the description, and then discuss their reasoning. So whether they would go or not go ahead with the task. So we had 12 scenarios in all, 3 for each category. So we had factors related to risk related to self, so under a great deal of stress, someone who's tired, someone who's ill. We had risk factors related to equipment. For example, the handbrake isn't working, the tractor hasn't had any recent maintenance conducted. Lack of safety features such as a missing PTO guard. And we had issues related to the environment. So, for example, having to drive your tractor on the edge of a ditch which has clearly suffered from erosion. So an example of a scenario, and these are short scenarios that just give an overview of the task that the farmer might have to do. This is the fatigue scenario. You had a busy weekend on the farm. You didn't get to bed last night until 5 a.m. You're due to begin cutting hay with a tractor at 7. Do you proceed with this task? So we asked them the same question for each of the scenarios. Now, I won't go over every point, though we can obviously discuss that later and over lunch. but there are certain points that I wanted to highlight and that will probably resonate with you. Interestingly, several farmers, now I asked them about seatbelts. That was one of the missing pieces of safety equipment. You might have recently seen the resurgence of the campaign in terms of Buckle Up for Iceman, the farmer who was killed due to a lack of seatbelt. Now, in terms of seatbelts, the farmers reported that they didn't think they were important, I didn't think they were a relevant piece of equipment, but many of the reasons given for that was that they didn't feel they had a high degree of usability. And this is where human factors might really start coming into play. If you want people to use a piece of safety equipment, it needs to be easy to use, it needs to be functional, it needs to be efficient, it needs to have high levels of usability, or that person is going to put it aside and ignore it. So it's just something that I wanted to mention in terms of a slightly different perspective on that. Not only do we need to encourage the safety behaviour of remembering to put your seatbelt on, we need to perhaps look at the design of seatbelts and make sure that they're functional for the use that they're designed for. Now, there's a general perception in the literature that farmers are generally risk-taking. This study didn't indicate that. It indicated that they judged each scenario individually and reacted to what they perceived was a risk within that scenario. Some risks they judged to be lower than others, but they weren't generally risk-averse or generally risk-taking. So they didn't just say they would go ahead in every scenario, but neither did they say they wouldn't go ahead in any scenario. And something to bear in mind before I then go over the 4 main results I wanted to talk about is that pretty much all of the farmers, when they said they would go ahead with a task, mentioned work pressure, time pressure, the need to complete a task, the need to get a job done, no one else being around to do it. So that's kind of a background to then the further discussion of the other elements that they brought in. Now, in terms of stress, in the scenario describing a farmer who has suffering from symptoms of and a high level of stress, the majority of farmers said that they would go ahead, which is perhaps not surprising. They felt generally those that wouldn't go ahead said that it might be a risk, and there was only 5 of those. The majority said that they would go ahead, but what was interesting was their responses. So they said that stress is part of the job. You can't just stop a job because you're feeling a bit stressed, you've just got to get on with it. They also said that work was part of the stress relief. So basically they said, if I don't do this task now, I'll have to do it tomorrow, I'm going to get even more stressed, I can't put it off. So actually doing the job, completing the task is stress relief in and of itself, which is also kind of an interesting approach to dealing with stress. In terms of handbrake, now to those of us who don't perhaps operate tractors on a daily basis, perhaps drive cars, handbrake is a pretty essential piece of equipment. Farmers don't agree with that, or these farmers didn't agree with that in terms of these scenarios. So I said the handbrake isn't working. The farmer's response to that was, oh, I don't need a handbrake anyway. It's not an essential piece of kit. That it's basically redundant. There are other ways to stop the tractor. You might use the plough as a handbrake. You might use the electronics to stop it. So it doesn't really matter, we'll go ahead. And again, the majority said they would go ahead with the handbrake not working. Minimum did identify that this might be a risk. The tractor might roll down a hill, for example. And some of the others said that they would go ahead unless they were working on a very steep hill. But the majority didn't seem to feel it was an important piece of kit. Then we had a fluid leak. Now, interestingly, this was an unidentified fluid leak. Are you then going to continue to use the tractor? The majority said no, but not for a safety issue necessarily related to themselves. This was related to a potential financial repercussion. So basically, like, I don't know what this fluid leak is. If I use the tractor, I could break the tractor, and then I'm going to have to pay for the tractor. So I'm going to investigate it fully before I use it. Very few of them said, also, this could be brake fluid, and that could lead to an accident. So they were primarily considering the financial ramifications. Interestingly, some of them seem to feel that leaking is perfectly normal for some tractors and not something you need to worry about, which perhaps speaks to their kit rather than their attitude. And then we've got missing PTO card. Now, you'll be pleased to know the majority said they wouldn't use a tractor that had a missing PTO guard. Many of them said it's a critical safety feature. They'd seen videos, they'd seen stories about injuries. They wouldn't use it until the guard was replaced. High level of risk to self and others. However, there was a minority that did say they would go ahead. They said things like, I'll go ahead, but I'll take a bit of additional care. I'll go ahead, but I'll tell other people not to go near it. And this is interesting and worrying from the perspective of, if you then take some of the other failures in non-technical skills we talked about earlier, becoming so focused on a piece of one element of a task that you forget what else is going on around you, chances are that if you're in a rush, you're under a lot of time pressure, you might have the intention to take additional care around this piece of very dangerous equipment, might not happen in reality. So again, it's just thinking about changing attitudes, perspectives, what are the kind of areas that we might need to talk about. So that's where we are in terms of non-technical skills in farming. That was a very brief overview. Anyone who would like full copies of the paper, you can just ask me. I can furnish you with them before you go, or we can discuss them fully later. But in terms of sort of further research, what I'm interested in doing next is having a think about what are the factors that might influence non-technical skills. So farmers working tired, working stressed, or working in certain conditions, might that limit their non-technical skills? Also thinking about barriers to non-technical skills. Are there certain aspects of farming that might make farmers less interested in enhancing their non-technical skills or might prevent them from using those skills? For example, some of the farmers that I've talked to anecdotally indicate that farming is a very manly profession, that you can't admit to weakness, and being seen to engage in particular tasks, for example, wearing helmets on quad bikes. None of the farmers around me wear helmets. I've asked them why. They say no one else does. Bit of peer pressure there, possibly. So I'm interested in exploring those kind of barriers. Also interested in terms of looking at larger farming conglomerates and whether farm workers feel that they can speak up about safety. So farm worker goes to a tractor, said tractor has a faulty handbrake or what have you. Do they feel then comfortable saying, I don't feel comfortable using that tractor, or do they feel the pressure that they have to go ahead and use it anyway? Briefly lost the slide there. And the final thing I'm interested in your opinions on are how relevant do you see non-technical skills to agriculture? How can we go about raising awareness? Would educational materials be useful? Training be useful? Suggestions of other areas of research that might tap into your own interests and what you're looking at and how non-technical skills might fit with that. So really open to all kinds of discussion. So we're running a little late, but we did have an additional comfort break. So what I'm saying is we have 15 minutes of questions now, but do feel free to nip in and out during that question moment if you like. So if anyone, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask any of us?
Hi, I'm Leslie from the Scottish Government Rural Policy. Sorry, can I ask you to get so that people online can hear the questions?
Hi, I'm Fiona Leslie from the Scottish Government Rural Policy area. Did you see any examples of, you mentioned cognitive tunnelling, in that agricultural environment and surveys you did you see any suggestion of perhaps more cognitive tunnelling in certain scenarios than others when you posed the questions to them?
And the risk sort of perception?
Yes.
Not really. Because I think primarily though because I was asking them to react to a provided scenario, and I think you're really going to notice the cognitive tunnelling itself. It came out more really in sort of interviews and elements such as that. Certainly a lot of cognitive tunnelling when it came to more certain times of year than certain tasks, exactly. So harvesting, sowing, and also during times of sort of lambing and what have you. But there were certain elements related to cognitive tunnelling to do with tractors. Again, not noticing such a complex piece of equipment, not perhaps focusing on so much on one element that you're missing something that's going on elsewhere. So I'd say certain times of year when you're doing more cognitive tunnelling happens, and also operating tractors and other complex pieces of machinery.
Thank you. And sorry, I've got a follow-up question on something else. Regarding the research and the questions about staff, when you asked the questions about staff, did the farmers recognise the unpaid family members as staff, or were they counting them as family in a separate box?
So I haven't done the study looking at staff yet, but in the interviews, farmers seem to count family members as staff, paid or unpaid. But that's certainly something that would be worth exploring in terms of if we do go on to look at speaking up about safety. Again, if you're a family member, might you feel more confident in raising an issue than perhaps someone who's being paid on a contractual basis? That might be something that's interesting to explore.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, Amy, John McNamara here from Teagasc, if that's the right word, in Ireland with the Farm Advisory Training and Research Authority. Compliments on your research, first of all. I think it's badly needed. You know, my own research is on adoption and that sort of stuff. And behaviour is of course coming out as a huge element in that. And my own research and out there would show that the extension paradigm kind of prevails, that you have early adopters, late adopters, and non-adopters, and dare I say it, laggards. So I think that's worthy of in future research, to different farmer characteristics to it. And indeed, Mr. Rick Brunswell was in Ireland recently, and he explained their recent research, which had a broadly similar. He had people that were unclear who were, dare I say it, non-adopters. I did a brief review of this in my own PhD a few years ago, and I found that temporal awareness, that very little work done on it, first of all. That's the first point. And a paper there, they're saying that it was difficult to train people, to change their capacities. Thank you.
Amy, congratulations on your piece of work, and to everybody else that's spoken today. Lorna Patterson from the National Farmers Union Scotland. Sorry. It's not so much a question; it's more of probably a list of statements. The main difference between farming and whether it's aviation, helicopters, planes, whatever, oil and gas, is it is financial at the end of the day. Farming is not, despite what some people think, particularly rewarding in terms of finance career, which is a shame. It's rewarding in other ways. But the difference between a farmer on a farm, whether he be a farm worker or owner-occupier or a tenant, trying to achieve a job, a task under a lot of pressure, and say a helicopter pilot, is if the helicopter pilot does not achieve his main objective for the day or the hour or the moment, and he decides to land and not go ahead with his job, he will still, in my opinion, still be paid his salary and everything else. So nothing will change except his own personal pride, because he probably wanted to finish the task or even start the task. For a farmer, it's not like that, as we all probably recognise. It means that you either don't get your harvest in, or you lose a calf, or you lose a lamb, or the bull gets out the field, or the piece of machinery, whatever it is. There's a huge repercussion, and that's why in many occasions they do take these risks. It's not an excuse, but I think we have to recognise that in this room, that comparing aviation and oil and gas with agriculture, I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do, but they're not, in many ways they're not similar, because the financial element of it is very, very different.
I guess that, because I did mention that the farming is a very unique environment, but in terms of helicopter pilots, drillers, etc., if they didn't do the job, they'd be fired. Because when it comes to offshore industry and aviation, it still is all about money. The idea is that you want them to do the job as safely as they possibly can. The advantage that pilots and things, and maybe you guys can jump in anytime, is that if they're really ill or really tired, they could ring in sick. The farmer doesn't have that option unless they're a contractual farm worker. So there's that element, but still, in terms of the pressures, financial pressures, it's very much similar in that these individuals would be fired equally if they proceed with a task, whereas a farmer is potentially gambling with their own safety. Aviation pilots, offshore drillers are gambling with everybody's safety. So in some ways the pressures are even greater. However, in terms of financial perspective, there's definitely issues there in terms of financial reward that farmers should receive for their products and the support they should have and everything like that. However, I don't feel that I'm qualified to discuss any of that. My little piece of this, if you like, is to acknowledge those difficulties and think, well, what can we do in terms of a non-technical skills perspective? And perhaps one of the best things about this is developing free online courses, free training courses, things that farmers can do for free that will make them safer whilst they are dealing with all of these pressures that they have to deal with. Because I don't think it's something that you should necessarily ask farmers to pay for, But I think that if we can really enhance and boost their non-technical skills, we can end up cutting the fatality rate, then that's my aim. That's my only aim, is I would like to cut the fatality and injury rate in farmers, and I think non-technical skills is one of the ways to do that.
I would just like to add in, I totally agree with you because, if you're offshore, then no, you still get paid, right? You still get paid at the end of your shift. Having said that, it was one situation when oil price was $120 a barrel, everybody's having a good time, holidays all right. The best that we managed is 74, and that was yesterday, okay, and everyone was making a hoorah about it. Mostly it was hitting 40, 50. You didn't drill well, you would be fired. You would be taken on the next chopper off. And I know that sounds sensationalist, but that really happened. And a lot of the guys thought, well, if I don't drill this well, I got a mortgage to pay, I got, holidays, I got kids, I got the car that I promised I would use. So no, it's not safe, but they still have that pound sign, dollar sign in the back of their head. I don't do this, I will lose my Christmas bonus, I'll lose my end bonus, I may lose my job, and I may even lose my drill crew's job because of me, because they often work together. So I appreciate where you're coming from, 100%. There is still an element of that offshore. I mean, I know that there's lots of nice talk online about safety offshore and how this is improved. Yeah, thank you. But cost is still very much, and not just from a company perspective, but I've done training courses where it's been going very well in the morning, and then I come back from lunch and it's like a genuine funeral, and I ask what's going on, and the guys have had their personal assessments come in, and they're finding out that they don't have a job anymore, and we're happy to training course. So there is still that element.
And there's a knock-on effect there. When there's less business going on in the North Sea, there's less need for helicopters to transport the people to them. And so with redundancies being quite high in that industry also, I would say that particularly with the offshore transport pilots, money and redundancies was one of the most common things talked about. It was on everybody's mind all the time. You could say, sure, you can say I'm not feeling up to it, but what? I'm not feeling up to it tomorrow or the next day. What makes the employer not look at me and say, do you know what, maybe this isn't going to work out. So it's definitely on their minds. Not to the same degree, I'm sure, but it's definitely a factor that's there, and it's present. It's in everyone's head.
And I guess the final thing would be to say that the aviation and offshore gas, it wasn't meant to be a direct comparison, more here's what other industries have done, what can we learn from them. So farming is definitely unique, there's no doubt about that.
We turned the table mics on rather than passing to the things above your head there, holding the microphone, just make sure any conversation is fully picked up until we turn them off, okay?
Yep.
Yeah, me, Keith Morrison, Health and Safety Executive from Belfast. I suppose this question for the three. First of all, I found that really fascinating because what it does for me for the first time is take some of the risks and concepts and categorize them and start prioritizing them. The language that you accept can change depending on what sector. It's the first time in a long time I've seen people looking at risks and separating these things out. So there's a lot of commonality, I think is what I would say about these translated. One of the differences that I would suggest, and I think my question is in and around technical competence. So again, there's a lot made and an assumption made perhaps in certain areas that there is a technical competence there. And certainly a lot of the incidents that we've seen, we've got highly skilled farmers who can do anything, and that's part of the problem, actually. But they've maybe never been trained on how to deal with animals properly or maintain vehicles or the technical skills. So I'm just interested in how much of a link between highly technical skills like offshore drilling and flying helicopters and flying planes, where the assumption is that people are well trained there, you hope, and then moving into non-technical skills. Whereas I think in the farming sector we have a challenge around the technical competence. And that's not to run farmers down, as I say, they can turn their hand to nearly everything, but there isn't that formal competence. So maybe we were on the link between the two, or the differences that you maybe find between the two.
and gas as something that everybody has, but let's be honest, I don't think that's the case. There is a huge variation in skill capability across not only the same role, but even the same team. And I've been through some training courses and I've seen some different people, and I wonder how they got to the end of it. And a lot of training companies, I don't mean this in a mean way, but a lot of training companies, you're being paid £1,500 to get somebody through something, to make sure they get through it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're technically competent or tough. That doesn't mean that they're technically competent. It means that they've got a trainer who's good enough to get them through it because they've been given the knowledge by the client, the operator. And so there is still probably a large problem to do with competence. But some of the offshore driller guys, they can do anything. Just like the farmers, you get some guys that are just fabulously amazing. And I don't know if this is the same case in farming, but we have a problem where a lot of them are made redundant, or they've got early retirement, and so some of our best guys are often on holiday. They go to Canaries now, they don't work anymore, and so we've lost a huge wealth of expertise where that technical competence is being passed down along with those non-technical skills.
And I think that you're right that farming is also unique from that perspective. You're right that a lot of the other industries, there's equal emphasis, really, technical knowledge, non-technical skills. And I think that farming, there's a lot of education coming through now in the colleges and things. The younger farmers coming up are going through a lot of training, which is great. But you do still have farmers out there who learned as they went, really, And I do think, case in point, I find it really interesting. My husband runs a delivery yard, so horses, not a proper farm, but he had a digger delivered the other day, and I was horrified that the delivery was made. They said, there's the button to turn it on. Bye. Never used a digger in his life. No, and it was just, there wasn't even a question of training or anything like that. I was just like, on you go. And I was just like, wait a minute. So I do see where you're coming from. There's definitely, because the two skills go together, technical competence, non-technical skills, they really enhance and develop each other. So you're right, and we're certainly not saying that you should forget technical competence and give preference to non-technical skills. It's really developing both, and I think they can really enhance each other. And I think what we'll do now is we'll take a brief break so everyone can stretch their legs, grab a cup of coffee or whatever. Then we've got the discussion groups for an hour, so you'll have plenty of chance to then raise your additional opinions and discuss these kind of things further. So we say maybe 5-10 minute break, and then come back and sit at your tables and we'll run the